particular my co-editor, Wong Sok Yi. It is Sok Yi, through her enthusiasm, her sincerity and empathy, who managed to persuade Dr. Poh to work on his memoir with her. She then kindly allowed me to get involved when Dr. Poh decided that he wanted to use documentary materials to support his analysis of the times and events through which he lived. That this would be a history of post-war Singapore with him as the guide. He calls this a historical memoir. This is not only a historical memoir, however. This is also a historic publication, a landmark publication. Among other things, this account of Singapore, Dr. Poh's account of Singapore of the 1950s and 60s is the first, I would say, that links Singapore history, post-war Singapore history, from the 50s right up to present day, in a way that is not along the logic of the Singapore story. We are indeed very, very fortunate to have living in a time of deception. The chances of having this book become a reality is actually very slim if you think of it. How many people in their 80s have that ability to recollect events and experiences more than 60 years ago, the way Dr. Poh has been able to? In fact, for Dr. Poh, I think that the passage of time, the fact that it took so long for the book to eventually be published, has in fact sharpened his analysis, allowed his analysis to be even sharper and sharper with the passing of time, as he has never really stopped thinking about what he would like to write. The passage of time has also meant that Dr. Poh has been able to read more current colonial office documents that have only been available more recently, and which historian P.J. Tam Hing Jin has very kindly made available to him. And some of these documents are in fact obtained by P.J. Tam using the Freedom of Information Act in the UK. So finally, we are really very fortunate that Dr. Poh has maintained the stamina and the dedication to produce this historical memoir and to continue to give heart to all his comrades. If I were asked, having worked with Dr. Poh for this book in the past 2 years, as a historian, what did I find most unexpected in Dr. Poh's account? I would say that it was finding out that even when he was in prison, Dr. Poh had already knew that when he was out, he would head for the archives in England to look at the documents to find out the decisions behind Operation Cold Storm and other political decisions that were taken that landed him and his comrades in prison. Dr. Poh went to the UK archives in 1994 when the documents relating to Operation Cold Storm was available with the expiry of the 30-year embargo. Now, Dr. Poh is not the only person to have done this. Others of his comrades have as well. Among them was the late Tam Jin Hui, who did not live to write the memoir he had in his mind. Nevertheless, Jin Hui fostered a relationship of mutual respect between academics and former political prisoners, which this book is an outgrowth of. Dr. Poh has also said on a number of occasions in doing this book that if only Jin Hui was around, he would really have a great person to discuss matters with. But in the end, Dr. Poh is the only person who has gone to the archives among his comrades and have finally written a book using the documents that he has found. The chapters in Living in Time of Deception of the 1950s present an understanding of the formation of the PAP up to the 1959 generation. Now, Dr. Poh's book covers really the whole span of post-war Singapore history, but the period that is really the most clearly documented is the 1950s, and his account of this shatters the kind of ideas that we have about what the 1950s was. The usual idea we have is that it is a period dominated in the latter part by Lim Yew Hock and then Lee Kuan Yew as Chief Minister, and eventually, 1959, it is Lee Kuan Yew as the Prime Minister. Okay? We see this usually as a break from the colonial stooge to the anti-colonialist. Okay? But what the documents have shown us, in fact, is that it is not a break. The transition from the Lim Yew Hock government or the Lim Yew Hock years to the early years of the PAP is actually one of continuity. Why do I say this? It is a continuity because the documents have shown that the arrests that the Lim Yew Hock government made, which led him to be called colonial stooge, running dog, and so forth, were in fact in collaboration with the PAP's Lee Kuan Yew. So in that sense, what we were seeing and what Mr. Lee Kuan Yew himself has called his actions and his speeches in those times, pro forma for show only. Okay? In fact, that was the veneer, that was the show. What went behind this was in fact that both parties agreed to do this. For Lee Kuan Yew, you can understand why he wanted the left wing out of the way. He couldn't do it himself because they were members of his party. For Lim Yew Hock, he knew that by arresting, taking the hardline, he would not be able to win the 1959 election. That was very important to him. But why he agreed to do this was because he was under the impression given by Lee Kuan Yew that the PAP and the Lim Yew Hock's party would be running the 1959 election on some form of collaboration or alliance, in which case he would not have to be punished electorally because the people would then, not vote against him because he and the PAP are basically in coalition. Alright, so Lim Yew Hock fell for that. Okay, and agreed to work closely with Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, bearing the odium for himself that he is the colonial stooge, the other guy is the anti-colonial hero. Alright, whereas actually they were running along the same track. Now, this book is very heavily documented. A lot of footnotes, colonial office records, newspapers, parliamentary reports, whatever. And we realize that, in fact, it is very heavy going to most people who are not familiar with Singapore history. We wanted to avoid that, but we realized that it is not a luxury for us to write simply and clearly without so much documentation. To write without documentation as fully as we have done in Singapore is the privilege of people in power. Dr. Poh's book, we expect, will be scrutinized very heavily, alright? Checked, rechecked, looked at, re-looked at, to look out for mistakes, to look out for trips, to look out for poor arguments, all sorts of things. Now, any good book welcomes this. And I think Dr. Poh certainly would welcome the scrutiny. But whatever critiques that arise, whatever responses that will be, one hopes is for the furtherance of knowledge, not for its not obstacles to knowledge, and certainly not hindrance to knowledge. So, documents give the book its authoritative voice. Nevertheless, Dr. Poh Soo Kai is the guide through the documents, and that he does not make pretense of not being. There is no attempt, there's a very long-winded way of saying, there is no attempt to be objective. Alright, we all think that historical accounts have to be objective. Alright, now, It's a long debate among historians, but there is no such thing as objectivity. That doesn't mean that there is no such thing as facts. Facts do not speak for themselves. The historian brings meaning and life to the facts. Okay? And this is what Dr. Poh has endeavored to do. So, this memoir weaves a narrative of the left wing into the document. So, Dr. Poh weaves his story and the story of his friends and his generation into the Singapore history of the 50s, 60s, 70s, and once Postor comes in, once he is detained, he brings in the story of what is it like to be in political detention. Not just the physical or the mental kinds of pressures that they go through, but also not only those who lived through, okay, and triumphed over the mental tortures, the physical tortures, stayed right to the end, but Dr. Poh also explains those who were not able to resist the pressures on them. He writes about their lives, he writes about their decisions with understanding and with compassion, I would say. One of his comrades, who is also detained, who has read this book, said that this is the account of a man of great kindness and understanding for humanity. Okay? I think that is something that is not an exaggeration. In the 17 years that he was in prison, not once had Dr. Poh thought of signing a security statement to seek release. What made him stay so steadfast? He wanted to preserve his credibility. He wanted to preserve his credibility, his integrity. He wanted to fulfill the historical responsibility that he had as Assistant Secretary General of the Barisan Socialists when Lim Chin Siong was the Secretary General. He wanted to do all this so that he could record how he was living in a life of deception. Given the circumstances that befell him, Dr. Poh withstood 17 years of his life in prison, okay, in order to write this book. Finally, who are his readers? Okay. Dr. Poh wrote for his comrades, both those of you present, those of you too busy today, those of his comrades who have passed on. Right? He wants to give them back their place in history. He wants to be able to speak and help them understand what it was that impacted on their lives and made it so different. As he said, no one has escaped unscathed, not himself included, and it does not include himself. So this is Dr. Poh's gift, I think, of a legacy to people of his generation. He has also given us a gift of historiography to historians, to history students. Now that is a big word, historiography. By this I simply mean that his book has opened new vistas, new ways of looking at things for us to pursue. He does not in any way, and I certainly do not, see his book as being the final word. There is no such thing as the final word in history, but he has opened ways for us to appreciate, the possibilities that looking at this period allows us to do. Right? He has made it possible for us to challenge, or he has challenged the claims that the history of Singapore cannot and should not be an open-ended study. All right? It has to be an open-ended study. He has given us an example of it. But finally, this book is Dr. Poh's gift of history to the most important people today, the younger people of Singapore. Right? We await with hope what they have to say about this. Thank you.